Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to the channel. This right here is the AMD R7 265X and it cost me just 35 bucks. Today, we're going to see how good this GPU performs and if it's still usable for gaming in 2021. The AMD R7 265X was released by AMD on October 8th of 2013. It uses the 28nm process node on the GCN2 architecture. Alright, and the last thing I want to check out is because this card was advertised as manufacturer refurbished, as I see no way that could actually be true on this card. I want to pull it apart and see if they actually went through and changed the thermal paste as advertised. To get into this card, it's a total of 4 Phillips head screws. And then pulling off the heatsink on the card, we can see that the thermal paste definitely has not been replaced recently. This thermal paste does look like it's at least 3 to 4 years old, if not the original. The rest of the card is decently clean, with the heatsink and fin stack having very little dust, and the fan also looks to have been recently cleaned. There was also very little dust on the PCB of the card. As you can see here, the thermal paste is really dry and could probably even be the original thermal paste from back in 2013. Now for testing, I'm just going to clean that off and replace it with some new Arctic MX4. Reassembling this card is very easy. You just have to plug the fan connector in and reinstall the 4 screws. Now, let's get to the benchmarks. Alright, here in the AMD driver you can see the R7 260X showing up along with the rest of the specs of the test system. I am running this with a Ryzen 7 1700 overclocked to 3.8 GHz with 16 gigs of RAM. Here are all the detailed specs. Now, just running through my usual firmware test, we can see that this GPU is performing around 10% worse than a RX 460 and is staying decently cool while having a relatively quiet temperature. As I can barely hear the GPU, and the system is sitting right next to me. Alright, now starting the games out with Fortnite using 1080p at the competitive settings. Dropping in, we are dropping a little bit down from 60 FPS, but it is definitely playable. Now on the ground, we're getting a pretty solid over 100 FPS with it never really dipping below 70. This definitely is a very playable experience, even though it does stutter a bit when you're dropping in. Next up, we have Valorant, and at 1080p using the max settings, we get around 100 FPS with 1% lows above 60. If you would turn the settings down to low, you get around 150 to 160 FPS with 1% lows above 100. In Star Wars Battlefront 2, and one of the more demanding parts, we are getting around 50 frames a second using 1080p at the medium settings. You do get 70 to 80 in most of the rest of the demanding parts though, and this still definitely is a playable experience. Alright, and now for the best optimized and least buggy game of 2020, we have Cyberpunk 2077 running here at 1080p using the lowest settings. We are getting a bit over 20 FPS, but the very large stutters make it definitely unplayable. Turning the settings down to the 720p, this is the lowest 16:9 aspect ratio resolution, we do get a bit of a frame rate bump up to the low 30s, but the stutters still do make the game pretty unplayable, and overall, you aren't really having a good time playing this game on a GPU like the R7 260X. Alright, now starting off with Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 using the lowest settings at 1080p. Taking off here, we are getting around 20 frames per second. This is like sort of playable, it's pretty unplayable, and definitely if you would be using a larger plane at a larger airport, your frame rate would be at like 10 FPS. Switching it down to 720p low, we're getting around 30 frames a second. This does make it a bit more playable, but still there is some noticeable stutters, and in a larger plane you'd still only have like 20 FPS. Now way down to 640 by 480, the lowest resolution. It does have a lot of things just like messed up so they aren't really readable, and the game isn't really playable at this resolution. This also didn't really get us any higher of a frame rate. Next up we have Rogue Company, and at 1080p using the high settings we got a average of 64 frames a second, but with 1% lows that was so low that the game was unplayable. Turning it down to medium, our average went up to 75 frames a second with 1% lows at 50. This definitely was a very playable experience. When I turn these settings down to low, I got an average of 127 FPS with a 1% low of 68. This definitely is a playable experience on this GPU using either medium or low settings. And lastly, I just wanted to show the 3D Mark scores in Firestreak. We got a graphics score of 4918, and in Time Spy we got a graphics score of 1542. Alright, so the R7 260X can definitely handle some esports games at 1080p. Some newer AAA games do definitely struggle, although most of them are somewhat playable using 720p low settings. Overall, I would say this is a decent GPU to pair with something like a 3rd gen i5 if you can find it for the $35 that I paid. Currently, the going rate for these is like a bit over $50, which is a lot higher than I'd say these are worth. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.